Okay, hi. So we're gonna start the second session now. And today I'll be talking about the three S's of presenting. So I've broken down some things that we've learned over the years, and I've helped remembered it with like three S's. Okay, so the first S is scripting, and scripting is basically everything that you do prior to coming in the judging room. So creating your script, what you want to put in your script, the order of how like your script is gonna look like. So that's gonna all be in here. So the first thing is your mission. So your mission statement is actually really important because everything that's not related to your robot, so your outreach, your sponsorships, all those other things should all relate back to your mission. And because your mission is like one of the most important things, it's probably best to mention your mission statement in the very beginning of your presentation. That way, the judges know like how all your outreaches and stuff connect to one another. And I'll give an example to that. So let's say our mission or my mission is to spread STEM in my school district. So one outreach you could do is to pick up trash, but that doesn't really like relate to your mission. That doesn't really follow your mission, even though it's a really good thing to do. It's good community service and it's being involved in your community, but it's not really following your mission statement. Versus having booths at schools or going to your local middle schools and elementary schools and talking about STEM, that follows your mission a lot more and it makes more of an impact in terms of your mission. And so, like, these two things are both very good deeds, and they're both good things that you can do, but one follows your mission more. And the judges want to see that your team is very goal oriented. They want to see that your team has a certain vision in mind, and by following your mission, that shows that your team has a lot of organization and stuff, and a lot of organization and a lot of um, just like drive to do a certain outreach. And that's why you should relate everything back to your mission. The next tip is to always emphasize on your strengths. So I know it's a 5 minute presentation time, and it's easy to split it up into 2 minutes and 50 seconds of robot versus 2 minutes and 50 seconds of outreach or non technical stuff, and 2 minutes, 50 seconds of technical stuff. But that doesn't really make sense, especially if one aspect of your team is stronger than the other. So let's say you have a really strong robot, your mechanisms are very innovative, your robot is very consistent, you're scoring really high points. You want to spend more time talking about your robot because that's the better aspect of your team. And so the judges know that you're going for a robot award versus if you have a really strong outreach program where you reached a lot of people and you feel like you made a really big impact. Talk more about your outreach, spend more time on the different outreaches that you've done, elaborate on those outreaches, go into detail about that. And so our team personally, the past couple of years, we're pretty outreach oriented, so we spent a little more time on our outreach versus on our robot. Details over quantity. So this is very important. It's really easy to want to talk about everything because you just want to share everything that your team has done, but that actually may not be the best way to come off to the judges. You want to focus on the best aspects of what you're doing. So for your robot, don't talk about all the mechanisms. Talk about your most creative ones and your most innovative ones. So let's say, I guess I'll use last year's game as an example. If you had a really cool launcher where it launched things in a way launched the rings in a way that a lot of other teams didn't. You can talk a lot about your launcher and the process of building it and how you came up with that idea, and spend a lot more time on that versus like talking about your drivetrain if your drivetrain is very like just a normal four-wheel drivetrain or very basic drivetrain. Or in terms of outreach, don't like even if you've done 40 different outreaches, you don't need to talk about all 40. It's probably best to focus on your top three or your best three where you feel like you made the most impact in those outreaches and really go into detail about that. Talk about your personal experience in it, how that made an impact on you, how you made an impact on your team, how that made an impact on your team. Talk about how that goes back to your mission, and that way the judges will see that you're a lot more passionate about things and they'll hear more about that experience and like know more about that experience rather than having very little information but knowing that you did a lot of outreaches. So it's really best to focus on those details and really go into depth on those details versus talking about as many things as you can. So there's also a certain order and flow you should have your script follow. Some things will have a very natural flow, so if you start talking about your technical stuff, so your robot and your program will follow one another, and then you go into your non technical. Personally, for our team, we start off with our mission statement, and so it's really easy to transition from our mission statement to our outreach because all of our outreaches follow our mission statement. So that's one way that we had our natural like flow to it. It's probably not best to go from build to outreach to program because it has there's like a break between your programming and your build, and a lot of times your robot and your program will go together really well. So splitting it up by putting outreach in the middle isn't the best idea. Another thing to we recommend is to start on a really strong note and end on a really strong note. So if your outreach is really strong, start on your outreach, and if your robot is pretty good, end on your robot, and maybe if your program is not that special, then you can put your program in the middle. You just want to make sure you have a good, strong first impression and a lasting last impression. And try not to jump around between topics, so don't talk about one mechanism and then talk about an outreach that you did and talk about another mechanism. That like jumps around and it gets kind of confusing. So the second S is supporting. So supporting is basically everything that you do that's not like presenting it or scripting it. So things that you can give to the judges or things that the judges can see. Starting with the visuals. So visuals are actually a really good way to help the judges like see what's going on with your team. Last year we had slides and we had most of our slides barely had any words on it. It was just a lot of like just pictures on a screen, and we would talk about these pictures and elaborate on the pictures rather than having really large boxes of text. You want to avoid having a lot of text, especially if you're doing like a poster this year, or like even if you're doing slides again, try to avoid having a lot of text because the judges can't read that. So just try and talk a lot about your visuals and elaborate on your visuals. Uh, and another thing is there's an example right here where there's like four pictures, right? And four pictures isn't that many visuals, but you can see how they're like overlapping with one another. And that may look like more aesthetically pleasing because it's like a collage, I guess. But you're kind of cutting away from the pictures, and it gets kind of confusing where like the whole picture, it just gets kind of confusing and messy. And also there's text on top of the pictures. It's really hard to focus on the pictures itself. So this is like a bad example of how you would show your visuals because there's just so much happening right now. It's so hard to focus on it. And also, like, I know nothing about any of these events. And so if I just show these pictures and say, like, oh, here are some of the outreaches we attended, like they don't know what outreaches these are because they weren't with you in these outreaches. Like I understand your team knows a lot about these outreaches, but the judges don't, and you have to really keep that in mind. So try and talk about each visual specifically, and all the pictures that you have on your screen should be like important pictures. It shouldn't be pictures because it looks like there's a lot of people attending your outreach. It should be pictures that are very important that you can talk about and it relates to your what you're saying. So like this picture on the far left, I can say like, oh, at this specific outreach, we hosted a button making booth, and here are a couple, and like we had the kids make buttons, and that was a really cool experience. Versus like the picture right next to it, where there's just like a crowd of people around a booth. You don't really know what's happening at that booth, and so maybe that's not the best picture to have. Handouts and props. So when you're giving things to the judges or showing things to the judges, you want to make sure that they have a purpose and like a reason that you're showing them that. So if you're giving out like a handout, where our team would sometimes give like small portfolios, you don't want it to be like a lot of pages. You don't want it to be a lot of text or just like a lot of things happening. You want to only give handouts if that handout has a specific purpose. Don't just give them out, and also don't give too many out because you have to keep in mind that the judges are trying to listen to what you're saying while also going through all the material that you're giving them. And so if you give them too much stuff, it's likely that they're just not going to look at any of it, and that ruins the point of it. And props are actually a really good way to stand out, I think. But only have a prop if it helps the judges visualize something or it's important to what you're saying. Don't just give out props because you think it looks nice or because you think it's don't ever do something just because you think it'll make you stand out. Make sure you have like a purpose for what you're doing. So that's just like a tip that I think we've learned. For your body language, in this case, what under the supporting a subheading for body language, what I mean is like everyone that's not talking. So when there's one person presenting and the rest of your team is just kind of standing behind them or just like watching them talk, you don't want to be like unenergetic or you don't want to be like, you can't zone out when one person is talking, even though you're not presenting. You have to make sure to stay engaged still, nod at the judges, nod at the person, smile, and maintain eye contact with the judges because it shows that you're engaged in the presentation. And I know that maybe we've practiced this presentation like thousands of times, but you have to still act like it's your first time hearing it and you have to act very interested in it because if you look bored, if all the team members look bored, then it'll bore the judges out because it just doesn't look like anyone is excited about what's happening. So it's important to maintain good body language even when you're not presenting. And I know that may not seem like a big difference, but it just like if you're constantly like swinging around waiting for someone to finish talking, it's distracting to the judges because they start to focus on you swinging around or you moving around versus the actual person that's talking. So you want to make sure to just like stay engaged, look focused, don't try and draw too much attention to yourself, but just like make sure you stay engaged the whole time. And then also the way you arrange yourself. So I know a lot of teams will have like the first person that's speaking on the far left, and then the next person that talks right next to them. And so finding those like in this order where they would step forward, step forward. The first person that talks would be on the far left, and then everyone that follows them is just like next in line. And that's, I guess, an okay way to do it, but it can be kind of boring to just like follow down the line. So sometimes our team would have like variations where the next person that's talking wouldn't be directly next to the person before them. It would kind of go in like a different order where there was like some spacing, so that way the judges can like their eyes can move around, and it's like less boring. But again, you don't want it to be like the first person that talks on the far left and then the second person that talks on the far right, because that just can get kind of distracting. You don't want the judges' eyes to be moving like too much. Another thing is, especially this year, because we're probably going to have to wear masks when we're doing judging, to step forward, the person that's talking to step forward on the line. That way, the judges know who's talking because they can't see your mouth moving. They know who's talking and they can maintain eye contact with that person, and they can distinguish who's speaking. So stepping forward is one really good way to distinguish the person that's talking. Next is actually speaking, so like how you present and how you like give good energy. So when you're talking, be really excited about what you have to say because you guys are building robots and doing these amazing outreaches and making a difference in these kids' lives. Like you have to be excited about what you're saying because these are exciting things to do. Like these are very cool things to do and you have to show that you're excited about it. And so like one thing that I recommend is if you're talking about one mechanism on the robot, have the person that built that mechanism or worked a lot on that mechanism talk about that mechanism because they know that mechanism best and they also will probably be the most proud of it because they were involved in the process, and they'll be more excited about it. So that way the judges can like feel their excitement and feel how like proud they are, and it'll like they'll feel that energy. Another thing is don't be stiff. So when you're talking, you don't want kind of just your hands behind your back and you're just like looking at them. You want to like move your hands a little bit, talk like just like you know how when you see guest speakers on like TED Talks and stuff, they'll like move their hands a little bit and it just like makes you look less stiff. It makes you look more fluid. It just like it leads to a lot more of like an energetic look. Like when you talk about something and you're excited about something, sometimes you like move your hands around. Like when you talk to your friends about a movie you watched and you talk about like a really exciting part, you like move your hands around because like you're excited. That's like the same thing you can do here. Just make sure you have a lot of energy. And you also want to maintain eye contact with all of the judges. Don't just look at one judge the entire time. Try and distribute your eye contact. And I know it can kind of be hard to maintain eye contact. So like maybe look somewhere near their eye, like their forehead or their nose or something like that. Just try and make sure to like look at all the judges. And practice. Practice is actually really, really important. And practice with everyone because on the actual day, you don't know who your judge is going to be. Your judge could have no experience in FTC at all. They could know nothing about FTC. They could be just a teacher at the school. They could be a parent. They could really be anyone. And so you want to practice with as many people as possible. So when you're doing your practices, you can have your judges be like parents, teachers, engineers, alumni. Just get as many people as possible. That way you can please the most amount of people possible. But with that, you also have to make sure that when these judges are giving you feedback, you have to think about what feedback would work well with your presentation. Um, it's really hard to try and determine what you should like add to your presentation based on what other people say. But at the end of the day, your team knows everything best. So if a judge is telling you to talk about this specific event more, but you personally, your team doesn't think that that event is that important, then maybe don't talk about it more. Or if you're like short on time and you really can't add any more information to that one part, then don't talk about it more. Like you have to think about what would best apply to your presentation. And I know this can be hard because you really want to please everyone, but it's impossible to please everyone. You can't give everyone, like, everyone will always have something to say about your presentation and add things that they think you can improve on. But maybe if it's not the best advice, um, you can, like, your team has to determine what advice you want to take in and what advice isn't best. And you also want to ask the judges questions about what they're saying. So if the judge says, like, if your practice judge says, like, oh, I think some of you guys were talking a little fast, you should ask, like, oh, can you tell us which person was talking a little fast? So that way that person knows to talk slower the next time instead of like everyone talking a little slower. I know like calling someone out may not be the nicest thing to do, but it's actually really helpful. Like telling one specific person, like, oh, can you speak louder? Or, oh, can you slow down? Can you enunciate your words better? They'll understand that more and they'll work on themselves, and so everyone knows what they need to improve on. And that's the important thing about asking questions to your judges. It will lead to an overall better presentation because every specific person knows what they need to improve on. And like they can specify what they want you to improve on so that way your presentation gets better. Okay, and the next thing is answering questions. So, like after your 5 minute presentation, the judges will start asking questions, and there are some very basic questions that come up very often. So, questions like, "What's the most innovative part of your robot?" "How do you handle team arguments?" "How do you how did you come up with your robot strategy? What's your favorite outreach? How do you organize your team?" Those are some like very basic questions that will come up a lot. And so what our team does is we have like a document with like a list of very common questions, and we have like the answer to all those questions. Like we type out the answer to all the questions. And so that way when the judge asks that question, we're like prepared for it. But then another thing I want to say is when they ask you a question, even though you anticipated that question, you shouldn't answer like you shouldn't answer like you already knew the question was going to come up. Like you kind of have to act like you hadn't heard that question before. So like if they ask like, "Oh, how do you organize your team?" You can't just be like, "Oh, we organize our team blah blah blah," like you're saying it like a list because you already memorized it. You have to act like you didn't memorize it. So it's okay if you stumble a little bit, if you have some and like things like that. That's okay to have because it shows that it's organic, like you're answering these questions organically, even though maybe you didn't, like you already expected that question. Another thing you can do is to have several narratives that link back to the judges' questions. So what that means is like last year, one of the things that our team experienced was we had to transfer from a school team to a community team because our coach like couldn't really handle being our coach anymore. He wanted to go do other things. And so we had to go through that transition, and it was kind of difficult because we went from having a teacher as our coach to like parents as our coach who didn't have experience in like FTC, that much experience in it. So that was like one of our experiences that were really hard for our team. And so when the judges would ask questions like what was a really difficult part of your team or what struggles did your team have that you think not many other teams had, we bring up that experience. And so we're bringing that narrative to that question rather than answering that question with that narrative. It's like the opposite of the first of having a question and answering it. And another thing is when you answer your question, so the way our team does it is if one person knows the answer to a question, they'll step forward. That way there isn't like two or three people coming forward and talking at the same time. So once that person steps forward, before you step forward, you have to make sure you know how to start your question, how to start your answer and how to end your answer. But like before you step forward, because if you end on a really bad note, it just comes off as kind of like you didn't really know the answer at all, and it wasn't like you weren't prepared for it. So if the judge asks something like, "How do you organize your team?" Before stepping forward, think about the first thing you're gonna say and the last thing you're gonna say. So you can think like, "Oh, okay, I want to talk about how we have these different subgroups and how we have and that's how we organize our team. So I'll show you like a bad example. If the judge asks, "Oh, how do you organize your team?" You step forward and you know how you're going to start, but you don't really know how you're going to end. So you start like, "Oh, our team organizes ourselves by having three different subgroups. We have a program subgroup, a build subgroup, and an outreach subgroup. And this is how we organize our team." And yeah. So you see how like you end with an and yeah. That's not a good way to end it because it just doesn't. The judges don't know what and yeah means. You have to be more specific about it. So before you step forward, think about how you're going to start and how you're going to end. So you can step forward and say, "Oh, our team organizes itself with three different subgroups. We have a build subgroup, an outreach subgroup, and a program subgroup. And for each of these subgroups, we actually have heads or leaders of these subgroups. And all those leaders will get together constantly, and they'll communicate a lot together, so that way everyone knows what's happening at the same time, and that's how we organize our team." Like that's a much better way to say the question, where you have a beginning where you directly answer the question, and then you have a middle part where you kind of elaborate on it. And that's another tip. Make sure you always answer the question directly. So when the judge asks like, "What is your favorite outreach?" You shouldn't be like, "Oh, we had a lot of favorite outreaches." Like some of the outreaches we did was we did a STEM fair, we helped FLL teams, and I don't know, we went on a tour to this place. But my favorite outreach would probably be blah blah blah. You shouldn't like bring up those first three outreaches because it doesn't answer the question directly. You want to make sure when you answer the questions, the judges know exactly how you're going to answer and the judges know what you're going to say. You don't want the judges to have to hunt around for what your answer is. So that's another tip that we have. And that's basically it for the presentation. So now I'm going to give some time for like a Q&A where you have any questions, you can just feel free to ask. Okay, so I'll bring up a question that I had in the last session where I think it was kind of a good question. Someone asked, like, how do you determine whether your robot is better, or your technical is better, or your non-technical is better, and how do you like distribute that time best? So what I would say is like for our team, it was very obvious which one was better. There was one year where we had a lot of really strong outreaches and we did a lot of pretty amazing things in outreach. And our robot was it was still pretty good, but it was a very basic robot where like a lot of other teams had very similar aspects to the robot. So we spent a lot more time on our outreach section when presenting because that was just what we were stronger at. And we spent a lot less time on our robot because our robot wasn't like super innovative. It was very consistent. It just wasn't like that creative. So we spent less time on that. And so that way we were able to determine which one to spend more time on. But in other cases, it can be harder to determine where you think like it's a pretty even split. You have a good outreach and a good robot. You don't have to spend more time on one of them just because you think you should. If your technical and non technical is split up pretty well, where you have both very strong, like non technical and technical, you can split it up into 2 minutes and 50 seconds for both. Like that makes sense. It's just whatever works best for your team. But that was one question that came up in the last session. Okay, one person asked, how do you answer a question you haven't prepared for? Um, I think that's kind of a hard thing. You just kind of have to know uh the like so if a judge asks you a question and you don't really know how to respond to it, um don't step forward just because there's like a little bit of time. Like there's gonna be a small like 5 or 10 seconds where it's just like silent because everyone's trying to think of an answer. And I think that it is better to have that 5 to 10 second of silence versus someone just stepping forward and trying to answer the question. Because if that one person steps forward and they answer the question, but they answer it like pretty badly, and the other members, while that person was talking, came up with a better answer. But the answer that they came up with contradicts the first person answer because the first person was just trying to rush and make sure the answer was questioned. It like comes off as like very disorganized. It's best to take some time and think about what the judge is trying to ask you. And you can also ask them to like repeat the question if that helps you answer the question better. But there's really no way to prepare for it. You just have to like think about what the judge is asking you for, and think about how they how like what kind of answer the judge wants, or what kind of aspects of the team. Like, okay, if the question is a technical question, then have one of your technical members answer the question as best as they can. Don't have like a non-technical person trying to answer it because that doesn't make a lot of sense. And even if you don't hit the answer directly, you don't have the answer, like you don't answer the question perfectly, um like as long as you really tried your hardest and you think it's somewhat correlated to the question, like your answers like kind of answer the question but not super directly, that's also okay. There's just really no way to prepare for a question that you're like haven't been prepared for. You just have to really just try your hardest and think about what the judge is asking you, and don't rush to answer the question. I think that's like the final advice that I would give. Okay, if you don't have any other questions, I know I finished kind of early, but you can go ahead and join the other breakout rooms, like the other workshops, because I think there was a lot of other workshops that you can join. There's also another one. There was a workshop for judging overview, and that was like, I think that was kind of like ours, but it came from the perspective of judges, whereas ours is coming from the perspective of presenters. So I think the judging one is really important because it kind of tells you what the judges want to hear. So yeah, feel free to go ahead and try and join other breakout rooms.